Hello, and welcome to Voices of Wisdom from Native Cultures, the President's class at the Philosophical Research Society. And this is Vine Deloria Jr., who is a Standing Rock Sioux. I'm Greg, the President of the Philosophical Research Society, and I am quarantined, of course, like millions of people in the country, so doing the President's class from home. And this should be, well, I hope it's fun and interesting and the quality is okay. So I'm just going to switch back and forth like this as we go through the lecture. And I'm really excited to talk to you about Vine Deloria Jr. because he's been a really important teacher for me. Maybe the most important teacher of Native American cultures. And he's a really interesting person, and funny and sharp and eloquent. Really, I think he's a good teacher for all of Western culture. So I would recommend, if you're interested in Native American studies or Native American life and culture, that you begin with Vine Deloria Jr. and a couple of these books that I'm going to work through tonight, or just mention. I'm not going to work through them. So I always do this, and I've done it now. This will be the fourth time, so I'm not going to spend as much time on it, but we have to be careful in studying Native American cultures. I am not Native. I suspect many of you are not Native. And so there's a responsibility that comes with studying these subjects. And the first and most obvious is that this is not our land. We're standing on their land as we do this investigation into their cultures. And land for Native people was never simply property. It was always place. It is always place. It's the source of their identity as a people and as individuals. And actually, there's no better teaching on that than Vine Deloria's work, God is Red, and we'll go over that tonight. And you'll see in a powerful way the role of place in Native American cultures. And again, we must understand that we're standing in that place, that we're desecrating that place, in fact. So again, that's the responsibility we have in studying these cultures. We also have to recognize that their language is a source of power and identity for them. And then our language is can be a source of oppression and marginalization to them. And again, I say this every time too. This is not about feeling guilty. I don't think that's a useful emotion for anything. But it is about recognizing a responsibility. And this is actually this is not esoteric or confusing. The boarding school movement in the second half of the 19th century did basically three things. It removed Native children from their land, the main source of their identity. It forced them to adopt English as their only language, and they were punished for speaking their individual tribal languages. And they were forced to change their dress, their clothing. So when we use language like, especially slurs like redskin, but when we use the term Indian, and you're going to hear Vine Deloria Jr. using that term a lot tonight, or Native American, that's fine. They use those terms too, but we have to understand the history of the term, which is basically that there was no such thing as Native Americans pre-contact. There were only Apache and Pueblo and Anasazi and Kiowa and Cherokee and Osage, they were not all one thing. They never saw themselves as one thing. We did that. Euro-Americans did that, and their descendants, and most famously Columbus, who called them Los Indios because he was lost. But it simply means the indigenous people. Well, this continent, when the explorers arrived, when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, was a multicultural, multilinguistic, multi-tribal place. It was extremely diverse, 200 different languages at least, different religions, etc. So all I'm saying is when we use the term Indian, as Deloria will, and he does that consciously, when we use the term Native American, as we do in our title here, just want us to understand that that's a colonial term that places all these tribes in the same category. And sometimes we need to talk like that because American policy did that. And so they created a reality out of that word. There is a history here, and Deloria is going to engage that history deeply. There is also what Joseph Campbell called universal and ethnic notions. And one of the things we want to do here is avoid the universal. Sherman Alexie says, when people say something's universal in my work, it just means white people understand it. I hate the word universal because it strips, if it's used alone, it strips the ethnic and local and social and place concepts and origins away from wisdom. And so in our study of voices of Native American cultures and the wisdom coming out of them, we want to situate that voice and that wisdom ethnically or in terms of place and language, etc. Because if you don't do that, then you're in great danger of appropriating the culture. And this is an amazing feature of American culture that you don't see, I don't think, anywhere else in the world. At least I haven't seen it anywhere else in the world, where you attempt to eradicate a people, not just one people, but all the peoples that are contained in that colonial word, Indian. You attempt to eradicate them, you nearly succeed, and then and to do that, you treat them as savages or inhuman. And then once you see that the victory is in sight, you romanticize them. And in romanticizing them, you not only create a reality that didn't exist, but you also take, again, what is theirs for yourself, whether it's ideas, rituals, symbols, etc. So we're going to avoid that. We're not going to appropriate this wisdom. And what I always say is Native people are speaking. Deloria especially has spoken. And I think we should see what we're doing here as an act of listening. How do we hear these voices? How do we situate them? How do we get out of our own interpretive strategies and circles and open up that circle to hear these other voices? So Deloria Jr. was part of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and there's a map you can see there in South Dakota, but right on the North Dakota line, right above the Cheyenne River Reservation, not far from Pine Ridge. In fact, Deloria Jr. was born right near Pine Ridge Reservation, or Pine Ridge, South Dakota. This is part of the Great Sioux Reservation that we talked about in relationship to Black Elk. So several tribes and bands within that, including the Hunkpapa and the Blackfeet Band. And this, of course, the reason I'm talking about it is its fine Delorias. Total members, about 16,000. On the res, a little over 8,000. But what you see here, we've seen before in our other studies, is that most Native people live in cities. And that's a result of a government policy during the Eisenhower administration called termination, which is aptly named. But its stated goal was to get Native people into urban areas, and not surprisingly, to take the remaining lands of the reservation as much as possible, but especially the resources, and move Native people into urban areas. And so you see total members, 16,000 on the reservation, about half that. Not unusual at all. The most famous Standing Rock was Sitting Bull, who was a Hunkpapa. Standing Rock has Hunkpapa and Blackfeet bands of the great Lakota nation. Sitting Bull was a great warrior, along with Crazy Horse and Red Cloud, and the Lakota in general were just amazing leaders and warriors. Sitting Bull was one of them. Sitting Bull was arrested. Well, they attempted to arrest him for participating in the ghost dance that we talked about last time. And in that process, he was shot by Indian police on December 15th, 1890. And it was only 2 weeks later that the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred. So a real nadir in Indian-white relations. Real low point. Today, the Standing Rock Sioux, their business is mostly cattle and farming. The tribe operates a casino and a quick mart and, some other tribal industries. You may know the Standing Rock Sioux, though, from the Dakota Access Pipeline protests of a few years ago. They led the opposition to this pipeline, and you can see the photograph there. This is from their website. The position of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe is that the Dakota Access Pipeline violates Article 2 of the Fort Laramie Treaty, which guarantees the, quote, undisturbed use and occupation of reservation land surrounding the proposed location of the pipeline. And in 2015, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, operating as a sovereign nation, passed a resolution regarding the pipeline stating, quote, the Dakota Access Pipeline poses a serious risk to the very survival of our tribe and would destroy all valuable cultural resources, unquote. So this is really important, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which is an ongoing dispute with Plains tribes and the United States government. And the United States government has been consistently in violation of that treaty. So Dakota Access Pipeline becomes yet another point of conflict going back to Sand Creek, Wounded Knee, the ghost dance. We're going to get into some of these other points of resistance. This is the most recent one. They organized runs for the resistance, horseback rides, marches. You may remember this. It was just a few years ago. A lot of celebrities and other tribes and other allies came to the Sacred Stone Camp, and they actually won the battle because the Obama administration, this was late 2016, the Obama administration denied access for the pipeline, or what do they call it, an easement. They denied the easement based on this protest. Of course, that was late 2016. And you know what happened is Trump came in office, and I think it was as early as February that he overturned Obama's order, and the Dakota pipeline went forward, and it is now pumping oil from the tar sands of Canada. I'm not going to go into this myself. I'm going to reference it for you. If you want to know about this Dakota Access Pipeline incident, there's no better account of it than this article at The Intercept, the Battle of Treaty Camp. I'm going to talk in a minute about some other resistances that Deloria talks about, and you'll see that it's an ongoing war. It's an ongoing resistance that began at contact and continues to today. And like I said the last time, in regard to Black Elk, Native American writers and activists don't see the ghost dance as having ended. They think the ghost dance continues because it's not about shirts that repel bullets. It was never really about that. It was about the resistance of colonialism and holding the United States to the treaties it actually made. But anyway, there's a great piece on it with a lot of videos, harrowing videos that I'll just refer you to. The Intercept, the Battle of Treaty Camp. All right, so let's learn a little bit about Vine Deloria Jr. Great face. I like that initial photo with his dog, too. March 26, March 26, 1933. He was born near Pine Ridge, next town over. Died November 13th, 2005. He was the son of an Episcopalian minister. He was in the United States Marines from 1954 to 1956. He actually has some famous ancestors and siblings. Bachelor of Arts, Iowa State University, 1958. Master of Arts, Lutheran School of Theology, 1963. That's right. So his grandfather was an Episcopalian minister, and he also received a seminary degree from the Lutheran School of Theology, 1963. He takes over the National Conference of the American Indians and expands it 1964 to 1967. He gets a law degree from the University of Colorado in 1970. So here is a dangerous Indian, as he would say, a Native American, a Standing Rock Sioux, who has a theology degree and a law degree. He becomes faculty at the University of Arizona and teaches there for 12 years, 1978 to 1990. Then he moves to the University of Colorado, 1990 to 2000. Okay. So here are his works. And like the other Native people we've been studying, you will see that he's fairly prolific here. A lot of these are essays that get published in various magazines or quarterlies or whatever, newspapers even, that he collects into books, but sometimes he just writes directly, like with Red Earth and White Lies. There are 3 books I would call your attention to, and 2 of which we're going to look at a little closely tonight. Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto, 1969, note the date. 1994, honestly, my favorite Vine Deloria book, God is Read, A Native View of Religion. I don't understand, frankly, why all religious studies graduate students and professors aren't referencing this book. It's a unique, imaginative, creative, profound understanding of religion. And I love studying religion, and I think religious studies is a great field, much needed, can answer a lot of questions and provide a lot of insights. But this is not like anything else you would read. It's not like William James or Rudolf Otto or Mircea Eliade. It's just a completely different take because God is read. It's a native view of religion. There's also 1995's Red Earth, White Lies. So Vine Deloria is going to take on the colonial culture, and he's going to take on this culture at its heart. And its heart is religion. And so he has a seminary degree. Law. And so he has a law degree. And he's also going to take on anthropologists. So in Red Earth, White Lies, the subtitle is, what is it? Let's see here. Yeah, Native Americans and the Myth of Scientific Fact. So he's going to get right at the root of Western mythology and ideology. And so to do that, he's really going to have to take on science. So this is a book about challenging the Bering Strait theory of the population of North America. He doesn't accept that, and he uses as evidence stories of Native people, but also written accounts from early explorers like Lewis and Clark. So that's an interesting book. But tonight, I want to focus on Custer Died for Your Sins and God is Read. So let's start chronologically with Custer Died for Your Sins. Subtitled An Indian Manifesto, and for good reason, because this really is a manifesto, and it was the time of manifestos, because this book, along with some others, is at the center of what's came to be called the Red Power movement. So, published in 1969, as I told you to remember the date, 1969 was an important year for the Red Power movement, for Native people in general, especially on the plains. Native people took over the island of Alcatraz in the bay there at San Francisco. It had been a prison, as you know. It was abandoned, and they decided it would, because of that, because it used to be a prison and now no one wanted it, and it was a rock in the middle of the bay, that was a perfect home for Indians. And so they took it over, held it for a while, and negotiated a way to relinquish it. But it spurred the birth of the Red Power movement, including AIM, the American Indian Movement. There was also the Trail of Broken Treaties, a march to Washington, and then the second Wounded Knee in 1973. Again, all these are fairly detailed and nuanced in their histories. I'm just mentioning them to you, like I mentioned most things in these lectures, as places for you to go to learn more. Wounded Knee, 1973, is a terrible, just another terrible incident in this long history of terrible incidents. It actually begins with a women's group on Pine Ridge, and then the warriors get involved, and it's not good. Now, you may also know of Leonard Peltier, who has been jailed for decades now. I don't believe he was at this Wounded Knee. In any case, the incident regarding Leonard Peltier occurred in 1975, where 2 FBI agents were shot on Pine Ridge, and Leonard Peltier was arrested for it. All kinds of problems with the trial, all kinds of problems with the evidence. If you want to get into that, there's a great book by Peter Matheson called In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, where he breaks it down. I think it's like 600 pages long or something. So it's pretty clear that Leonard Peltier was innocent. And if you don't accept that, then it's pretty clear that his trials were corrupt. He's now in prison in Florida and in his late 70s, I believe. President Obama had a chance to pardon him or commute his sentence, whatever the legal term is. He passed. And so I think it's pretty clear that Leonard Peltier will die in jail. I don't see any movement, any inclination in the existing administration to pardon any person of color. Now, again, very significant, complex incidents here. Alcatraz, I've just scratched the surface. Trail of Broken Treaties, Wounded Knee. Interesting what happens, especially since last week we were talking about this book, Black Elk Speaks, a reissue of the 1932 Black Elk Speaks by John G. Neihardt comes out in 1961. And along with this convergence of Native interests and activities, Black Elk Speaks enters that picture. And I mentioned last time in regard to Black Elk Speaks, Vine Deloria Jr. loves this book, and I think he recognizes the problems that we talked about last time in its creation, but he doesn't care because the book now belongs, I think, in Vine Deloria's mind, it always belonged to the Red Power movement, and it worked. He's not wrong. And in fact, there's a term in literary studies called the Native American Renaissance that was coined by Kenneth Lincoln. And he says the Native American Renaissance began in 1969 with all this activity, creative and otherwise, creative, political, activist. It also has a literary component, and that is with the publication of our next subject, our subject next week, in Scott Momaday's Housemaid of Dawn. And following Housemaid of Dawn, you have a series, well, as Lincoln says, you have a rebirth. Some people have argued about whether it was a rebirth or not. But whatever it was a point in literary history where Native American literature became more widely known. And again, that's partly through Black Elk Speaks, but also through this emerging literary movement that includes Momaday, Silko, and some others that we'll talk about. All right. So because this is a manifesto, I want to just show you the chapter titles. So let's just go through them. Indians Today, the Real and the Unreal, and we're going to go into that a little more in the next slide. Laws and Treaties. So just look at this. If you want to begin a study of Native American cultures, I recommend this book because look at what all it's covering. The disastrous policy of termination. Remember, I mentioned that with the Eisenhower administration. There it is. Anthropologists and other friends. There are actually some anthropologist jokes on the res. And you can just read that. Missionaries in the religious vacuum, government agencies. So Vine Deloria Jr. has a lot of criticism for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA. But there are many government agencies he takes shots at. We're also going to talk in this lecture about Indian humor. The red and the black, he has some really interesting perspectives, because remember that date, it's 1969, some interesting perspectives on the civil rights movement and the Red Power movement and how very different they were. The problem of Indian leadership, the Wounded Knee 1973 incident was really sparked by a corrupt BIA official named Dick Wilson, who was taking funds intended for the tribe, and you know the story. He was a corrupt official. So Vine Deloria spares no one who acts in bad faith, whether it's a Native person or a white person or any person. If you're acting in bad faith, he's going to call you out on it. But there is a unique problem of Indian leadership. Indians in modern society, again, that's 1969, and a redefinition of Indian affairs. So very involved in the political realm, not just activism, but also he's in Washington, D.C. a lot. His National Council of the American Indian does a lot of work. I mean, he's in the back on every front. And so let's take a look at a little closer look at Indians today, the real and the unreal. All right, so he opens the essay by saying, to be an Indian in modern American society is, in a very real sense, to be unreal and ahistorical. And we've seen that in our series so far, namely that the people that Columbus and those who came after met were unreal. That is, they were canvases onto which Euro-Americans painted their own beliefs. And in that sense, the Native people were not real. They were simply blank slates. In fact, there was never any question. If you read the diaries of Christopher Columbus, he immediately praises them for being intelligent and resourceful, good-looking, and then in the same breath he says they should make very good servants because they repeat everything that's said to them. They should be easily made Christians and become servants. There's no question. There's no moment of hesitation in interpretation of what these people are. They are unreal. And ahistorical, we talked about that too, in that Native people are seen by many, by the larger American culture, as to be gone. They are gone. The Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 was the end of Native Americans. So goes the prevailing opinion among, I would say, I don't know, many Americans. So ahistorical. And so that, if you think people are gone, if you think something's gone, that gives birth to a kind of nostalgia and appropriation. And so because they're ahistorical, we can have, and because they're ahistorical, because they're gone, we can take their stuff, their culture. And so we can dress up like Indians. We can claim Indian relatives and relationships. In fact, Vine Deloria has a great point about this in this essay. Is he does all this tongue-in-cheek. Well, no, not tongue-in-cheek. He does it with a satirical but humorous barb to it. He writes this: while a real Indian grandmother is probably the nicest thing that could happen to a child, why is a remote Indian princess grandmother so necessary for many whites? Is it because they're afraid of being classed as foreigners? Do they need some blood tie with the frontier and its dangers in order to experience what it means to be an American? Or is it an attempt to avoid facing the guilt they bear for the treatment of the Indian? So in this essay, I'm not really doing it justice. It's a seamless essay, beautifully done. I encourage you to read it. He talks a lot about his relationship with white people. He talks about how well-meaning white people tell him that they have a grandmother who was whatever. And he says, I've heard the names of tribes that never existed, and he doesn't, he just lets them go. He writes in the essay and, says, I've learned about the existence of whole new tribes in these conversations I have with white people. He also has a more profound and critical point in that when he writes that there is no subject on earth so easily understood as that of the American Indian. Each summer, work camps disgorge teenagers on various reservations. Within 1 month's time, the youngsters acquire a knowledge of Indians that would astound a college professor. And he talks a little bit about this, and it's a really interesting phenomenon of white people, is that we think we know this. We think we know these cultures. Why would we think that? He says, implies, and I think he's probably right, is that because we're on their land. And because a lot of our place names are from native languages. And I mean, I remember growing up being in the Boy Scouts, and this was a part of their educational materials, is that you should understand Native people. And I remember going as a boy and just walking along a hillside there in East Tennessee and finding arrowheads and taking them home. Again, all this is a confluence of ideology and ideas about Native people that, for one, we understand them, even though they're other. And so legislatively, politically, Indians have been other, and whites have held both these ideas in the same moment, sometimes in the same person, but certainly as a nation. So Deloria writes, civil rights bills passed during and after the Civil War systematically excluded Indian people. For a long time, an Indian was not presumed capable of initiating an action in a court of law, of owning property, or of giving testimony against whites in court. Nor could an Indian vote or leave his reservation. Indians were America's captive people without any defined rights whatsoever. So when it comes to actual corridors of power, Native people are excluded. And yet Indians are us when it doesn't come to actual power, when it comes to the white imagination. Deloria writes this: once the Indian was thus acknowledged, he in the essay, he says, eventually Native people did get these rights, and so they were seen, they were acknowledged. Once the Indian was thus acknowledged, it was fairly simple to determine what his goals were. If thinking went, the Indian was just like the white, then he must have the same outlook as the white. So the future was planned for Indian people in public and private life. First in order was allotting them reservations so that they could sell their land, because land is property, not sacred space. God's foreordained plan to repopulate the continent fit exactly with the goals of the tribes as they were defined by their white friends. So much here we could talk about, but I'll let Deloria speak. What we need, he says, the primary goal and need of Indians today, this is 1969, is not for someone to feel sorry for us and claim descent from Pocahontas to make us feel better. Nor do we need to be classified as semi-white and have programs and policies made to bleach us further. Nor do we need further studies to see if we are feasible. We need a new policy by Congress acknowledging our right to live in peace, free from arbitrary harassment. We need the public at large to drop the myths in which it has clothed us for so long. We need fewer and fewer experts on Indians. Here is, I think, a very powerful quote from the essay that I want to share with you. One of the foremost differences separating white and Indian was simply one of origin. Whites derived predominantly from Western Europe. The earliest settlers on the Atlantic seaboard came from England and the Low Countries. For the most part, they shared the common experience of their peoples and dwelt within the worldview which had dominated Western Europe for over a millennium. Conversely, Indians had always been in the Western Hemisphere. Life on this continent and views concerning it were not shaped in a post-Roman atmosphere. The entire outlook of the people was one of simplicity and mystery, not scientific or abstract. The Western Hemisphere produced wisdom. Western Europe produced knowledge. Perhaps this distinction seems too simple to mention, and you may have been thinking that as I was reading it. Deloria continues, "It is not. Many is the time I have sat in congressional hearings and heard the chairman of the committee crow about our great Anglo-Saxon heritage of law and order. Looking about the hearing room, I saw row after row of full-blooded Indians with blank expressions on their faces. As far as they were concerned, Sir Walter Raleigh was a brand of pipe tobacco that you got at the trading post." So you see Deloria's rapier wit there that also makes a very salient point. Now, one of my favorite essays is Indian humor, and honestly, the jokes are not that good. They're 1969 jokes, but his point is worth stating here. One of the best ways to understand a people is to know what makes them laugh. So let me read to you from the essay on this. "Laughter," he writes, "encompasses the limits of the soul. In humor, life is redefined and accepted. Irony and satire provide much keener insights into a group's collective psyche and values than do years of research. It has always been a great disappointment to Indian people that the humorous side of Indian life has not been mentioned by professed experts on Indian affairs. Indians have found a humorous side of nearly every problem, and the experiences of life have generally been so well defined through jokes and stories that they have become a thing in themselves. The more desperate the problem, the more humor is directed to describe it." And just by way of a personal anecdote, I can tell you I went to a Native American literature conference on the res in Minnesota, and I went to a session of papers, and it was on humor in Native American cultures. And this poor woman, she had a paper on cannibalism because many of the early depictions of Native people from European explorers were about cannibalism because who knows? Cannibalism is rarely practiced in the world. It was not practiced by Native people, but there was this bizarre concern about it among the European explorers. That and sexuality, but that's another topic. You should read them on the sexuality of Native people. It's very weird. Anyway, so this poor woman was at the conference, and somehow somebody had messed up and put her in this panel on humor. And she was writing about depictions of cannibalism in early European explorers' meetings of native people. And there was a native woman sitting beside me, and she raised her hand, and she's like, well, I think this is a great thing for you. I mean, the woman was just shaken because, it can be a fraught situation anyway for a white person to be commenting on Native American cultures. And here this poor woman was, everybody was supposed to be laughing, but her paper's about this horrible depiction of Native people being cannibals. So this woman beside me raised her hand and says, this is a great opportunity for you because now you get to find the humor in cannibalism. And I started cracking up, and I was the only one because I thought it was really funny. But no one else laughed. That happens to me a lot. Anyway, we leave the session, and I happen to get in the elevator with the woman who said that. And I just looked at her and said, the humor in cannibalism? And she's like, yeah, I was trying to help her out. And no doubt she was. So Deloria is right. The more desperate the problem, the more humor is directed to describe it. So what kind of jokes do they tell again? They're not great jokes. They're 1969 jokes, among other things, and they're kind of lame jokes. But here we go. In fact, the whole essay is basically jokes that are told on the res. It is said that when Columbus landed, one Indian turned to another and said, well, there goes the neighborhood. Another version has two Indians watching Columbus land and one saying to the other, maybe if we leave them alone, they will go away. A favorite cartoon in Indian country a few years back showed a flying saucer landing while an Indian watched. The caption was, oh no, not again. Well, and of course there are Custer jokes. In fact, the title of this book, well, let me just read it to you. The title of this book, Custer Died for Your Sins, was a joke on the reservation. Not seen that way, of course, by most whites. So this is Deloria. He writes, some years ago, we put out a bumper sticker which read, Custer died for your sins. It was originally meant as a dig at the National Council of Churches, but as it spread around the nation, it took on additional meaning until everyone claimed to understand it and each interpretation was different. Originally, the Custer bumper sticker referred to the Sioux Treaty of 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty, in which the United States pledged to give free and undisturbed use of the lands claimed by Red Cloud in return for peace. And under the covenants of the Old Testament, breaking a covenant called for a blood sacrifice for atonement. Custer was the blood sacrifice for the United States breaking the Sioux Treaty. That originally, at least, was the meaning of the slogan. And so, and now it's his manifesto, Custer died for your sins. Again, the jokes continue. When the Sioux found his body after battle, Custer had on an arrow shirt. Custer is said to have boasted that he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with his 7th Cavalry, and he was half right. He got halfway through. Deloria says his favorite joke is pictures Custer on top of the hill looking at a multitude of warriors charging up the slope at him. He turns resignedly to his aide and says, well, it's better than going back to North Dakota. Actually, the best Custer joke I heard was Vine Deloria lecturing in 1972. This is on YouTube, in fact. And he says, Custer, before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, tells the BIA, don't do anything until I get back. And so they didn't. There are also missionary jokes. There is the story of the old Chief Gall, Gall, a most respected member of the community, and the missionary comes and They build the church, and it's cold now. It's in the winter, and they give the old man, the grandfather, gall communion first. And he took the cup of Christ's blood and drained the entire supply of wine before returning to his seat. So he goes back to his seat to sit by the warm stove, and so the wine begins to take its toll, and the warmth of the stove, and he's feeling pretty good. And he says, "Grandson," he called out to my grandfather, "now I see why you wanted me to become a Christian. I feel fine, so nice and warm and happy. Why didn't you tell me that Christians did this every Sunday? If you'd told me about this, I would have joined your church years ago." Here's a longer joke, but a good one, I think. Another missionary was traveling from Gallup, New Mexico to Albuquerque in the early days. If you don't know, Gallup, New Mexico is sometimes called the Indian center of the world. You can look up why. So a missionary is traveling from Gallup to Albuquerque. He offers a ride to an Indian who is walking to town. Feeling like he had a captive audience, he begins to cautiously promote his Christian message. "Do you realize," he said, "that you're going to a place where sinners abound?" The Indian nodded his head in assent. "And sinful women who have lived a bad life go." A smile, and then another nod. "And no one who lives a good life goes there. And do you know what we call that place?" The Indian turned, looked the missionary in the eye, and said, "Albuquerque." He says the current joke in 1969 is that a survey was taken and only 15% of the Indians thought the United States should get out of Vietnam. 85% thought they should get out of North America. There are intra-tribal jokes where different tribes are joking with each other. 1964, Billy Mills, a Sioux from Pine Ridge, won the 10,000-meter run at the Olympics in Tokyo. The Sioux went all out to inform the other tribes of his achievement, and one day we were bragging about Billy's feat to the Coeur d'Alenes of Idaho, who politely nodded their heads in agreement. And finally, the wife of the chairman, Leona Gary, announced that Mills' running ability did not really surprise the Coeur d'Alenes. After all, she said, up here in Idaho, the Sioux have to run far, fast, and often if they want to stay alive. There are one-liners, and I like these a lot. Popavida, the great Pueblo artist, was quizzed one day on why the Indians were the first ones on the continent. "We had reservations," he said. Oh, I know. Another, when questioned by an anthropologist on what Indians called America before the white men came, said, "Ours." A young Indian was asked one day at a conference what a peace treaty was. He said, "That's when the white man wants a piece of your land." All right. So, Indian humor, according to Vine Deloria. And he is really funny and pointed. I remember being at a conference where he was speaking. He was a panelist on a discussion. It was a discussion on native land rights, and the panelists gave their talks, and I remember one was I think from a Catholic university. I don't know which Catholic university, and his paper was this agonizing, what do we do about these treaties, which are valid, legally valid, and yet we ignore them, and technically this land belongs to the Dakota people according to the Fort Laramie Treaty, and this agonizing hand-wringing over the legal nuances and complications. And Deloria was the respondent to the panelists, and the room was packed. It was standing room only. In fact, I was standing because I couldn't get a seat. Deloria turns to this Catholic scholar and says, "I thought they would have taught you this in Catholic school. This is actually very simple. If you steal something, you give it back." And the poor guy's face just turned red. And, that's fine, Deloria. Just right to the point, humorous, but also cutting and true. So this is God is Red, that I mentioned before, A Native View of Religion. One of my favorite books ever. And I hope you'll take some time to look at it. And I just want to mention this one essay because you can just read this one essay and it will change your view of religion. So let me go through that. So Thinking in Time and Space is an essay about how native religion differs from Western religion. And you have probably heard me talk about that difference being orality and literacy. And that's true, but Deloria marks another difference. He says it's the difference of basing your culture, your ideology, your belief system in time and its linearity versus space and its relationships. Deloria writes this: Western European peoples have never learned to consider the nature of the world discerned from a spatial point of view. And a singular difficulty faces the people of Western European heritage in making a transition from thinking in terms of time to thinking in terms of space. Well, what's he talking about? Well, for example, he says, in a culture of time where there is revelation that is true for all, regardless of time or space, then preaching is what's important. Because you have to get the message, and the message has to transcend time and space. It has to be everywhere all the time. And so preaching has to keep going. Versus ritual, which involves the body in space. Let me let Deloria explain it to you. Here's a quote. One of the features of Western religious practice has been the dependence on teaching and preaching techniques. Indeed, take away the preaching and the teaching, and there's very little substance left in some world religions. Christianity has been singularly involved in proclaiming the good news that involves the articulation of an impossibly complex scenario involving original sin, a cosmic redeemer, the catastrophic end of the planet, and the transportation of the saved to a new heaven, where presumably people will behave much better than they did on earth. Preaching and teaching have as their goal the possibility of changing individual personality and behavior, presumably in a manner more pleasing to the deity. A glance at the historical record will show that the hope of transformation is rarely realized and never seen on a large scale. That's just true, right? It's rare. This kind of transformation is rarely realized and never seen on a large scale. It's why Christians don't act like Christ. He continues, changing the conception of a religious reality from a temporal to a spatial framework involves surrendering the place of teaching and preaching as elements of religion. Rearrangement of individual behavioral patterns is incidental to the communal involvement in ceremonies and the continual renewal of community relationships with the holy places of revelation. Ethics flow from the ongoing life of the community. Now, this is me now in a parenthetical here. Ethics flow from the ongoing life of the community and are virtually indistinguishable from the tribal or communal customs. Compare that to the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not. Thou shalt. Because it's supposed to apply everywhere and at all times, apparently, some would say. But in a culture based on space, the ethics flow from the ongoing life of the community and are indistinguishable from customs, right? From customs. So what if just what you did every day was ethical? Just your basic customs of life. What if that was your ethics? Well, that's a spatial religion. He continues, there's little dependence on the concept of progress, right? Because that's a time thing, either on an individual or community basis as a means of evaluating the impact of religious practices. Value judgments involve present community realities, present ones, not a reliance on the part of future golden ages toward which the community is moving or from which the community has veered, right? No original garden where everything was perfect and we ruined it. No heaven, new heaven and new earth that's coming. Just the ever-present now. And you can now start to see the outlines of his point here, I think, which is quite profound. And so it has to do with abstracting religious experience out of place. And so there's a double meaning there that's very relevant. Out of place is out of place. Deloria writes, the question that the so-called world religions have not satisfactorily resolved is whether or not religious experience can be distilled from its original cultural context and become an abstract principle that is applicable to all peoples in different places and at different times. The persistent emergence of religious movements and the zeal with which they are pursued would seem to suggest that the cultural context, time, and place are the major elements of revelation, and the content is illusory. If not illusory, it is subject to so many cultural qualifications that it is not suitable for transmission to other societies without doing severe damage to both the message of revelation and the society which receives it. Such a powerful and actually fairly simple critique of all religions that seek to spread their message to the world, abstracting their religious experiences out of place and to therefore apply it to others in other places. And so this accounts for the really odd attempts to make a text that belonged to nomadic peoples in the Negev desert apply in 21st century America or 19th century America or whatever, anywhere else. The same is true for a text written under occupation, under Roman occupation by a people being persecuted, making that text, abstracting the religious experience of those people and the text that they created into a different place at a different time. It creates dissonance at best. It creates disingenuousness at worst. So he continues about thinking difference. And let me just give you one sentence here. The basic philosophical differences between liberals and conservatives are not fundamental, however, because both find in the idea of history a thesis by which they can validate their ideas. This is why I love Vine Deloria. This is what I'm talking about when I say we need to hear native voices, is that we would never get here because we, conservatives and liberals, are trapped in something we can't see because we're both working within this idea of history that does not exist for native people. So no wonder that conservatives don't understand and native people's place or respect it. And no wonder that progressives or liberals don't understand it either, because they're still trapped in their notion of time as the formation of identity and culture. Time, not space. And so here is Vine Deloria pointing this out for us from outside that tradition. He continues, American Indians hold their lands, their places, as having the highest possible meaning, and all their statements are made with this reference point in mind. Immigrants review the movement of their ancestors across the continent as a steady progression of basically good events and experiences, thereby placing history, time, in the best possible light. When one group is concerned with the philosophical problem of space and the other with the philosophical problem of time, then the statements of either group do not make much sense when transferred from one context to the other without the proper consideration. And that is a theme of Vine Deloria's work, the proper consideration. And I'll come back to that in a minute. He continues, the very essence of Western European identity involves the assumption that time proceeds in a linear fashion. Further, it assumes that at a particular point in the unraveling of this sequence, the peoples of Western Europe became the guardians of the world. Yes, and we do think that. The anachronistic nature of this theory should have been apparent. Western political ideas came to depend on spatial restrictions of what were essentially non-spatial ideas. And so he goes into great detail. Well, let me just mention it here about Vietnam. This is this is later, but he's still applying this to Vietnam. Winning that war, he writes, in any final sense would have meant total destruction of a land, Vietnam, and a people. It would seem to indicate the extent to which Western peoples, and Americans in particular, have taken the dimension of time or history as an absolute value. Our withdrawal from Southeast Asia would seem to demonstrate that in most military collisions, history is negated by geography. So he's saying that this notion of time as the ultimate reality, the absolute reality, conflicts with the notion of space and doesn't work because it's negated by geography, because time attempts to consume space and space sometimes bites back. All right, so sacred space. This is not just space, again. This is that Native people live by. It's not property, and I hear this a lot in dialogues about Native American issues, is whites sometimes see this as land rights, like at the conference I was talking about. It's not about land rights. It's about the sacred. And so when you saw the Dakota Access Pipeline protesters, their catchphrase was, "Water is life," because it wasn't about intrusions upon their land. It was about life, and it was about the sacred, and it's always been about that. And we, coming from our capitalist ideology and from our Christian ideology, both of which are based in notions of time, where space is subsumed under that, have missed that. We simply project onto them what our values are and say, well, we're taking this land, and we don't recognize sacred space. In fact, in that Intercept article, there's a video of a confrontation between some local law enforcement and some of the protesters, and it's a dialogue going back and forth just like this. I encourage you to look at it. The officer is pleading with the protesters to hear him, that he has Native people in his family and he understands. But I'm sure he's well-intentioned, and he does attempt to understand, but he does not get out of this notion of time and Americans' place in time, if you will. Americans' domination of the world by time. Anyway, and this is a statement that has stuck with me since the first time I read God is Red. It's actually in a different essay, but for me, growing up in conservative Christianity and studying the Bible in my first graduate degree. This is what got to me when I read God is Red. There is no salvation in tribal religions apart from the continuance of the tribe itself. Wow. Again, I love that he's so pointed, so clear, and yet gets right to the heart of the matter, and it's so profound. There is no salvation in tribal religions apart from the continuance of the tribe itself. And he doesn't mean the contemporary tribe. He means the nation. He means the people, which is what many native words mean, like Dene for Navajo means the people. The people are the only salvation, and it's not within your timeline. It's the people as a whole, from the beginning of their emergence or whatever to the future, which is unknown. It's the people and their relation to the earth, because if you are in a religion or an ideology or a worldview or whatever that is centered on space, then the most important thing here is relation, not abstractions, but relation. Relation. In fact, it's a phrase used in some ceremonies, all my relations, right? And you hear this as a refrain in Native American literature and culture, is the notion of relationship. There's no salvation in tribal religions apart from the continuance of the tribe itself. And let's hear his voice again. American Indians and other tribal peoples did not take this path in interpreting revelations and religious experience. That is the Western path of understanding a revelation as a one thing given in time. The structure of their religious traditions is taken directly from the world around them, from their relationships with other forms of life. Context is therefore all important for both practice and the understanding of reality. The places where revelations were experienced were remembered and set aside as locations where, through rituals and ceremonies, the people could once again communicate with the spirits. Thousands of years of occupancy on their lands taught tribal peoples the sacred landscapes for which they were responsible, and gradually the structure of ceremonial reality became clear. It was not what people believed to be true that was important, but what they experienced as true. Hence, revelation was seen as a continuous process of adjustment to the natural surroundings and not as a specific message valid for all places, all times and places. The vast majority of Indian tribal religions, therefore, have a sacred center at a particular place, be it a river, a mountain, a plateau, a valley, or other natural feature. This center enables the people to look out along the four dimensions and locate their lands, to relate all historical events within the confines of this particular land, and to accept responsibility for it. Regardless of what subsequently happens to the people, the sacred lands remain as permanent fixtures in their cultural or religious understanding. Thus, many tribes now living in Oklahoma, but formerly from the eastern United States, still hold in their hearts the sacred locations of their history, and small groups travel to obscure locations in secret to continue tribal ceremonial life. And I've been talking about Vine Deloria's voice, and we're fortunate enough to have videos of him. And here he is. There's so many powerful lectures he gave and talks. Here is one on the spiritual yearnings of the West.
It's a big dilemma. You need a big constituency in the majority to help you protect the sacred sites. But you have to talk about the sacred sites in order to convince people this is a worthy cause. I know I used to have quite a bit of conversations with Bill Tallball at the Medicine Wheel people on how you protect this. And he said, I'm just baffled because we get all kinds of allies among the whites and we make some progress. And then they all want to go out to that sacred site and experience it. And he said, here, you've asked them to help. You've told them it's real, that this is very necessary. And then you've got to turn around and say, well, we don't want you to go out there because we have to have solitude to do these things. We're not doing these ceremonies on a stage. In the first place, you want to keep ceremonies secret just for Indians. And then you turn around, all kinds of Indians are inviting non-Indians in the ceremonies. You say, what are we doing here? And then you see that most of them, 99%, get a really good experience, and a lot of those become better people. So everybody's happy. But they don't really get to any depth where they'd be useful as spiritual leaders, and they have no communities to return to. And you can hang around Indians for a while, but it gets kind of boring because most of the things Indians do are secular things. So it's a big dilemma, and I don't... At the start of the New Age, I was kind of irritated like the rest of the people, and the more I looked at it, I thought, well, if they're not expending their energy that way, they might be doing something really dangerous. So I thought, since it's just a low-level thing, there's no problem with it. We had a meeting on Indian religion at Harvard Divinity School, and one of the religious leaders opened the conference with a prayer and a pipe. We just passed the pipe around. And after that, it must have been a dozen whites came up to me just breathless. So I've never been in a ceremony like that. That meant so much to me. I just can't tell you how I love Indian religion. And a momentary experience, and I mean, no different than me lighting a cigarette, actually, in terms of what they understood was going on. Well, I mean, the craving is just, so there's a desperate need to appropriate from somebody, not necessarily Indians, but from somebody, some feeling, emotional feeling of authenticity. And the problem is that they all think of themselves as individualists. They don't have definable communities to return to. So they're just trapped. And I really feel sorry for them. Some years ago, South Dakota Highway Department asked me if I would identify all the sacred sites to the Sioux in South Dakota. And I said, of course not. It's better to have them undisturbed and unused than to have all these people tromping, busloads of Japanese tourists going through. And they were quite put off because they wanted them as tourist attractions.
So what is the wisdom of Vine Deloria Jr.? Well, it's far too vast and deep to get to here. So again, this is an invitation for you to read Custer Died for Your Sins, God is Red, Red Earth, White Lies, or to watch his lectures on YouTube, or to hear him in audio in any form. He's a powerful presence, a brilliant thinker and writer, and he's talking in all cases about sacred, philosophical, and ideological space. In other words, he's talking about space and place. And we don't really talk about that. Again, as he points out to us, we are trapped in this notion of time. And everything is organized in Western culture according to time and according to an initial golden age or a future golden age, or following along on history in which something's going to happen. We don't have to think that way. Native people didn't think that way. As Sandra Sprayberry says, when language touches land, place is created. And that's what they're talking, that's what Vine Deloria is talking about here, is place. Language touching land. And I would add ceremony touching land, putting your body in touch with this sacred space. It changes everything. And it's one of those signature ideas that if you can see, if you can grasp, it will change your outlook on the world. Am I still trapped in Western notions of time? Yes, but I can see out now. I can imagine another world. Thanks to Vine Deloria Jr., thanks to his voice, I can imagine that it doesn't have to be this way. And that is the beauty of all wisdom, is that it shows you something new. And Vine Deloria used humor so deftly. And he could take it, he could dish it out, and he could take it. It's a powerful thing that I wish, I don't even want to get into. It's a powerful thing that can be used so well in political and religious ways. Vine Deloria Jr. is a great philosopher. He's a great religious studies professor. He's a great voice of Western culture because he knows Western culture. Not only does he live under it, he is credentialed in it with his law degree and with his theology degree. So what he has also is a native understanding of religion and all these other things. But he is also a Westerner. And so his voice can be so helpful in seeing what we miss. And he gives us plenty to see. What does he give us? Honestly, and this may be the greatest gift he has given us, is he encourages, not encourages, he demands that Western thinkers become responsible for their own stories. So what permeates his work is this sense of, well, if you believe this, why don't you act accordingly, right? So what he does is strip through bad rhetoric and get to the point where actions are what are meaningful and how the words do not match up with the actions. So there is this dichotomy in Western culture. There are many. Time versus space, oral versus literate, words versus actions. And that's not to say that Native people don't lie or can't lie, but it's that it's not built into the system. It's not built into a spatial ideology. It's not built into an oral culture, frankly. It is built into a literate culture and to a culture where time is the defining concept. If nothing else, we can read Vine Deloria as Westerners and learn how to live up to the words we pronounce and proclaim, or to stop saying those things and say something else that is more in accordance with our actions. And once again, we see survival plus resistance equals survivance. This is Gerald Visner's term. And everything that Vine Deloria did in his life was for the continuance and benefit of Native people, but honestly, it was also for Western people too, because he called us on our shit. He called us to live up to the ideals that we proclaimed or to change the ideals. Survival plus resistance equals survivance. As you can see, I'm giving this lecture from home because we are in lockdown here in Los Angeles. Sorry, we're not in lockdown. We're in a safer at home order. So I can't go into PRS, but I still want to continue the work of PRS, and I'm doing it here. We are doing it here as best we can. So if you're able and willing, please give using the links here. And if you can't give, think well of us. We believe our mission is more important than ever, and we thank you for joining us on it. All the best to you. Take care.